As Israel marks its 75th Independence Day, something its founding generation could only have dreamed of, society is divided, so much so that leading experts, statement, and strategists have said that these internal threats outweigh the existential military threats. With the Jerusalem Press Club today to share his insight following years of public service, as well as academic excellence in the field of history, is Dr. Michael Oren. Oren served as Israel's ambassador to Washington, later becoming a deputy minister at the Prime Minister's office on behalf of the Kulanu Party. Prior to entering politics, Ambassador Oren was a renowned historian, and throughout his career has authored numerous publications, including 2 books, Ally on the US-Israel relationship and 6 Days of War on the Six-Day War, the War of 1967. Dr. Oren, thank you so much for being with us.
Great pleasure to be with you. Shalom. We want to say happy holiday, Chag Sameach, because it is indeed a holiday. Well, I'm not quite a founder of the state of Israel, not that old. But
no, I wasn't referring to you as a founder. I was saying that
I do have the great privilege of having worked with several founders. I worked with Yitzhak Rabin, I worked with Moshe Dayan, and I was the last assistant to Abba Eban. So I've had a great privilege of working with some of those founders, and I had a long working relationship with Shimon Peres. So a great privilege, and gave me insight too. One of the stories that Shimon Peres told me was that he was fishing around in the desk of David Ben-Gurion on the 14th of May, 1948, the day that Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the state of Israel. And in this desk, Peres told me he found a sheet of paper from the Israeli forces. It wasn't exactly the Israeli Defense Forces yet, still the Haganah. And on the memo, it said that Israeli forces only had enough bullets to fight for 1 week, for 7 days. And therefore, actually, the military was against declaring the state of Israel. And half of the Zionist leadership was against declaring the state of Israel. And the United States said that if Israel declared its independence, that the Jews of Palestine would be slaughtered. And the United States actually began to call up some 300,000 American reservists to help evacuate the survivors of the predicted massacre of the Jews of Palestine and of Israel. So that gives you a little perspective when you hear that actually for Shimon Peres telling me that story. Very, very profound. There's no way of sugarcoating this. Israel's going through the profoundest internal upheaval we've ever had, and we've had some strong and difficult internal upheavals, whether it be over the 1952 German reparations agreement, which was strongly opposed by then Menachem Begin, later to be head of the Likud party, and the Prime Minister Begin led fierce demonstrations against the German reparations. He lost that agreement, that fight. Israel did receive those reparations, and they became crucial for absorbing hundreds of thousands of Jews, particularly from North Africa and the Middle East. Other upheavals surrounding the 1982 First Lebanon War at the time, following the Sabra Shatila massacre. In Lebanon, 500,000 Israelis came out to the street to protest. It's 500,000 of a country that was about a quarter of the size it is now. So that's a lot of people. It'd be the equivalent to say about 2 million people coming out now. So right now, this upheaval, I think, is not just a matter of numbers, the 700,000 Israelis who have come out to protest. And keep in mind that 700,000 people out of 10 million, that means 9.3 million were not going out to protest. But that, I think, is not the important statistic. The important one is to remember that this fight over judicial reform, or as the protesters would like to say, an overhaul of the judicial system by the government, is revealing deep schisms within Israeli society, whether between Jews from Western background, Ashkenazim, and Jews from Eastern background, Mizrahim, religious and secular, people who live in the center of the country, and people live in the less developed periphery of the country, left and right, of course, Arab and Jew. And these schisms maybe have been plastered over in previous decades, but the fact that we're all facing an external enemy in the form of the Arab countries, today Israel does not face a conventional Arab threat. We've had Arab terror still, but not a conventional Arab army. When I grew up, the specter of Egyptian tanks rumbling through the ruins of Tel Aviv was a very real possibility. It was a nightmare that we all shared. And several times, whether it be 1967 or 1973, that nightmare appeared on the verge of being realized. So it wasn't beyond the imagination. No one thinks about Arab tanks rumbling through downtown Tel Aviv anymore. And so we have a luxury at 75 years old 75 years old, of facing up to our internal divisions. And the big question is, can we bridge them? And that is it's an open question. And here it helps to have had, first of all, the life that I've had here. I've been here for a long time, and also have a perspective as an historian. So in my time here, when I arrived in Israel in the 70s, we didn't have peace with Egypt. We didn't have peace with Jordan. Very poor country, lower middle class country. Our biggest export was citrus, was oranges. And there wasn't much food. Even the falafel was bad. And no restaurants, amazing. And we didn't have relations with China. We didn't have relations with India. That's half of humanity right there. There were enemy countries. It's hard to imagine. There was the Soviet Union with its satellite countries that have no relations with us. They were hostile. We had no relationship with Africa. We had relationship with one African country, the Ivory Coast. Amazing. And almost no relationship with Latin America, South America. With the United States, we had a friendly relationship, but not a strategic alliance with the United States. And you scoot ahead, 5 decades, and that Israel is unrecognizable today. I mean, if you had told me back when I got off the plane that this is what Israel would look like, that we'd have these relationships with China. India is one of our closest friends. That the former Soviet satellite countries are some of our closest friends. That we have a wonderful strong relationships with Africa, with Latin America, and peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, peace with 4 Arab signatories to the Abraham Accords, and with the United States, one of the deepest and most multifaceted strategic alliances that the United States has had with any foreign country in the post-World War II period. And the Israeli economy. Our economy is robust. We're a world leader in innovation. By just about any international criteria, Israel is not just a successful country, it's a superpower country. And it's regularly listed as like the 8th most powerful country in the world, with an army that's more than twice as large as the British and French armies combined. And with all the upheaval around the judicial system and our democracy, we have to keep in mind that Israel is one of maybe 5 countries in the world that has never known a second of non-democratic governance. And we're the only country on that list. It's the United States, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, Australia. We're the only country on that list that's never known a second of peace. So I think that Israeli democracy may be our crowning achievement. That's just in my lifetime. That's pretty extraordinary. I saw a million immigrants come from the former Soviet Union. I saw tens of thousands of Ethiopians being airlifted here. Truly miraculous events that I've witnessed. But I have an historical hat as well. I'm a historian by training, as you mentioned, and I look back at what this country looked like on May 14th, 1948. There were 600,000 Jews in this country. It's about the population of Boston today, with no army, no real arms, no planes, no tanks, no allies, no natural resources, surrounded by adversaries on all sides. Many of the people here were survivors of the Holocaust or refugees. And this country not only survived, but in many ways it thrived. We were able to quadruple our population in a few years and develop a modern democratic nation in the center of the Middle East, pretty much the most inhospitable region you could imagine. So that's amazingly impressive and miraculous. Having said all that, it hasn't been easy. We've had crisis after crisis, war after war, attack after attack, an eternal division in the world. In spite of these immense achievements in our foreign policy, Israel is still the only country in the world whose existence is questioned, its legitimacy questioned, its right to defend itself is questioned. Rising anti-Semitism in the world, disguised as anti-Zionism, anti-Israel fervor. And as I mentioned, these internal divisions within our society, which I think are the most severe, even as we face a strategic threat from Iran and its proxies in the region. So my answer to you is, what's the scorecard look like on 75 years of Israel's independence? Well, on one half, I think on our achievements, it goes off the actual scorecard. And I can't imagine another state that can rival these achievements in such a short span of time, overcoming such immense obstacles. On the other hand, I can't imagine many states that would still cohere, having undergone the type of threats, assaults, and internal divisions that we have. Israeli society, at the end of the day, remains very, very strong. I don't know about how strong our institutions are, but we can do some stronger institutions. But our society is very, very resilient, flexible. and it comes back. And that gives me source for hope that we will overcome the current crises, that we will address the divisions within our society, and we will devise ways of bridging them.
So thank you very much for all that. I think you've touched on a lot of the questions that I had intended on asking, but I think I'll take it from where you left off. You said Israeli social cohesion is strong, but our institutions need to be worked on. Do you have some advice on how we can re-strengthen those institutions?
In several ways. One of them is to not just to reform the judicial system, and I've just published the book, and I don't mind plugging it right here for a second, because it's a book called Israel 2048. It's about it's my vision for Israel on our 100th birthday. It's a project that I began in government and continued outside of government, and it contains chapters that relate to every aspect of Israeli life: education, social policy, foreign policy, relations with the Palestinians, relationship with the Israeli Arabs. I didn't shy away from anything. Some very controversial issues, but there's one chapter here that's devoted to the need to reform the Supreme Court. And I wrote it 3 years ago. And so you don't have to be a prophet to know that that situation, the relationship between the Supreme Court and the Knesset, was not tenable, wasn't sustainable, and needed reform. And the way to do that is to reform the Supreme Court and the judicial system in the way that retains the checks and balances system in the Israeli government, which in fact are weak. One of the weaknesses is the fact that we, instead of having 3 co-equal branches of government as you had in the United States, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, we only have 2, because our executive and our legislative are pretty much the same thing, the government and the Knesset. So one of the things you could do is strengthen the Knesset as a independent and co-equal branch of government, and not just an extension of the government. You can create a bicameral house in the Knesset. We have one body. We don't have local representation. So I live in Jaffa here, and if there's a breakage in the sewage system here, the residents of my neighborhood cannot go to Knesset and speak to the right honorable representative from Jaffa. We need that type of representation. We need to strengthen understanding of democracy here. We don't have the benefit of having a population that had 800 years of exposure to democracy as you have in the West, beginning with the Magna Carta. The vast majority of citizens of the state of Israel come either from the Middle East and North Africa or the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. We do not come from deep democratic traditional backgrounds. And so we need more civic training, more understanding of what democracy is. I see the word democracy being thrown around all different ways and with very little understanding of it. We also need, and I think this is the most pressing issue of all, it's the point I make repeatedly in my book, we need to have a deeper understanding of what sovereignty is. And the Jews, we were not sovereign for 2,000 years. And then one day in May 1948, we woke up and found ourselves the proud owner of a sovereign country. We didn't understand it. And there are large swaths of territory in this country, particularly south of Beersheba, and large segments of our population over which the state of Israel has no sovereignty, whether it be Bedouin populations in the south or ultra-Orthodox populations virtually everywhere where we have no control of the education system, and ultra-Orthodox children get less than a second-grade education for the most part in modern studies. These threaten the very welfare and perhaps even future existence of the state of Israel. So strengthening these institutions, strengthening civic society, strengthening our judicial system, strengthening our understanding of democracy are all crucial to make Israeli institutions as strong as Israeli society.
Okay, very clear. Dr. Oren, I want to bring you to maybe a more personal area. You served as a soldier in the army, a lone soldier, no less, like most of us, like many of us, myself included. Connecting to the issue of the demonstrations, while they might seem less disruptive to public life as they were before the holiday period, we see them now in a very different form that maybe even touches on the nerve of all Israelis as they've entered our military cemeteries. In your opinion, looking towards 2048, we don't have to go that far. Are we in 2023 lacking all the sacred cows, if you will, that we used to have in this country?
Well, we've broken a lot of sacred cows. The refusal of reservists to report for duty, given the overhaul, The general strike called by the History Group, the closing of the airport, the first time that the History Group has gone on strike for a political purpose and not for economic means, not for workers' rights, closing the airport. The only people who ever succeeded in closing our airport before this was Hamas with rockets. So that we did more damage to ourselves than Hamas did in the airport. Yeah, a lot of sacred cows. And it's very unfortunate. As a member of Knesset and a member of the government, I every year gave speeches at the military cemeteries. And I viewed it as a sacred duty, not an easy duty. And tomorrow I'll go again to 3 different ceremonies because I'm the head of an NGO that supports the bereaved families, fallen policemen and border policemen. And I represent that NGO. So I view that as a sacred duty. Having said all that, I think that politicians currently serving have to exercise extreme sensitivity on this day. And not just a matter of duty, it's also a matter of feeling and empathy. So for a member of Knesset who did not serve in the army, whose children do not serve in the army, to come and address the bereaved families of those who did serve and those who fell serving this country, I think shows a lack of empathy and a lack of understanding. And that was what needs to be exercised.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but it is important for me to follow up on one of the things you had mentioned. We can't argue that Israel's come a long way on the diplomatic front. You mentioned numerous places around the world with which we now have diplomatic relations, and of course, the strongest bond with the United States. However, I'd like to ask you about the issue of bipartisanship. Do you think that given this unprecedented recent intervention by the U.S. administration in these affairs, specifically with the judicial overhaul, we heard a lot of not just warnings, but also threats to boycott meetings. Is this dream of bipartisan support of Israel over?
Oh, it's certainly challenged. And I don't know exactly what we go back to where we were, even during the time when I was in Washington, which is now coming up on 15 years ago, where I could really sit with Democrats and Republicans and find common ground on Israel. We used to always brag that Israel was the only truly bipartisan issue in Congress. That's hard to say today. But there are forces at work in the United States which are beyond the ability of Israel to impact. We are not part of the cultural wars of the United States. We didn't invent wokeism. We didn't invent the counter wokeism, whether it be microaggressions or critical race theory. That's not about us, though we are often on the receiving end of these movements, and our ability to impact them are very, very small. So I think we have to be realistic about what's happening in the United States and to reduce as much as possible any temptation to transform the state of Israel into a political football or ping pong ball. And that is a great challenge for us. Truly, we can't overlook the fact that, throughout now more than 50 years, we're dealing with a situation in Judea and Samaria, which much of the world views as an occupation. Many in the world view it as an illegal occupation. And we are faced with a tremendous dilemma. On one hand, many people, myself included, would love to move forward to some type of reconciliation and some type of resolution with the Palestinian issue. We also know that by doing so now, it is impossible. There's no Palestinian leadership that has legitimacy to sign an agreement, has the ability to sign an agreement. And looking back at history, at the number of times that the Palestinians have turned down a two-state solution, I'm not entirely convinced that they actually want one. And we cannot create a Palestinian state that would quickly fall apart and threaten our very existence. And I think most Israelis understand that implicitly, but the world doesn't understand that for the most part, and it has become part of that partisan debate in the United States. Getting people to understand Israeli realities, the way the vast majority of Israelis who desperately want peace, but don't want a peace that's going to endanger our children. It's a very difficult dilemma we face. It's one of the reasons why whenever we do political polling, the Palestinian issue usually comes out dead last. And it's always surprising when I talk to European statespeople about this, or Americans. What Palestinians? That's all we talk about is the Palestinian issue. That's not what Israelis talk about. We talk about housing. We talk about the cost of living. We talk about security. Its reason is that the vast majority of Israelis just realize that at this stage, there's no real solution. And the best we can do is manage it better. I personally would like to see not just better security for Israel, but also to give Palestinians a sense of what they call a political horizon. if that's possible, to a degree that doesn't impair our security. And that is really the best we can do. This is the meaning of sovereignty. I often said, and I say in the book as well in 2048, that the definition of Zionism, the idea that created this country, that sustained this country, is responsibility. And it's only here in Israel where the Jewish people have responsibility for our electricity, our sewers, our defense, our foreign policy. But along with responsibility comes the need for clarity. What can and can be done, what must be done, what shouldn't be done. And these, some of the exercise of our sovereignty can make us unpopular in the world. But the alternative is not to have the state. And we have learned again and again throughout our history the prohibitive, unspeakable price of not having a state. And at the end of 75 years, I think we have to say that we live in a miraculous time, and there is an independent Jewish state in our ancient homeland where Jews have a place, and they needn't be on a boat going from port to port where no country will take them in. They'll need to be without defense. And I think that in itself is reason enough to celebrate.
I couldn't agree more. I do want to follow up with one more question. Do you have any different or additional message for perhaps the Jewish community around the world that's certainly looking with their own glasses on the situation right now, whether it's the things you just discussed vis-a-vis the Palestinians or other, they're obviously affected by global developments around the world, like the ones you discussed, not just in the US, but all around the world. We see alienation of Jews also in the United Kingdom towards Israel over these issues. Is there anything else that you would like to say on that front?
Same thing, pretty much the same. My grandparents were not born in the United States. They came from Europe fleeing pogroms. They used to tell me about hiding in basements while the Cossacks' hoofs went over, the horses went over their heads. And I have this sort of mind game I play. I go down into that basement and I talk to my grandparents and I say to them, someday there's going to be a Jewish state. And that Jewish state's going to be strong and vital and have a huge army. And it's going to defend Jews from all sorts of Cossacks in the world. You needn't hide in the basement anymore in that way. And that's the good news. The bad news is there's going to be a lot of controversy around that Jewish state. There's going to be it's going to be accused of being an occupier, and worse, it's going to have political divisions and social divisions. And do you think it's going to be worth it? And my grandparents will look at me and say, "Are you Meshugana? Are you crazy? You're crazy. I mean, you're going to have this state that's going to defend us, and have this army, and guess what? Everyone's going to speak Hebrew in this state, and we can study openly, right? Our Judaism and practice our Judaism. And, because of some political differences and what people say in newspapers, that's what's going to somehow deter us from getting to this state." They'll say you're crazy. You're crazy. And that's the mind game I play. I think my message.
It also connects to what you were saying at the very beginning about perspective. I think.
Perspective. I would say a couple of things to Jasper too. One is, let's be grateful. Let's understand that we live in a world today, which is not the world I was born into or grew up in, where every Jew in the world is free. When I grew up, millions of Jews were not free. We do have this state. And that, as I said before, is a miracle in some way. Be grateful for it. Be grateful for it. Yes, there's controversy. Yes, there are certainly issues here that make you uncomfortable and worse. Right? But also be humble. How many Jews in the diaspora speak Hebrew at a level that they can understand, a Hebrew paper such as those displayed behind you? How many know Arabic? How many know anything about Palestinian society? Anything. And would an American Jew, how would an American Jew think about an Israeli who doesn't speak a word of English, but comes to the United States and pronounces, makes far-reaching recommendations regarding the Constitution of the United States? Not a word of English. So you might be a little bit humble and understand that Israel has its own culture, its own politics, and understand that your sources for understanding this country are very limited. Perhaps the New York Times or one or two other papers. I encounter that all the time, by the way. The difference between the real Israel and the Israel of the mind that exists outside of this country. Very, very different, very different. And And that would be my recommendation. And the last recommendation, of course, is if you haven't been here, be here. If you contemplate staying here, stay here. At the end of the day, this is still the most exciting place, event, experience to happen in the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. And to miss it, and I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, and I would be damned if I was going to stay in New Jersey and miss this thing. Amazing. I've personally been through a lot. I've been to wars. My kids have been in wars. One child was wounded in a war. I've lost family member to terror. Been through a lot. The Rabin assassination. Moving to this country was the single best decision I ever made.
I think that's a very, very strong message to finish with. And of course, I'd like to wish you and everyone listening Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach, Happy Independence Day. Dr. Michael Oren, former deputy minister and former ambassador to the US and author of Israel 24/8. Thank you so much for your time, and really looking forward to better days, and definitely taking your messages with us.
Okay. Be well. Todah, Chag Sameach.
We hope you enjoyed that briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. If you did, like the video and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our future content.